thank you for the opportunity for sharing a small part of your journey. And I'd like to spend the next 40 or so minutes sharing some of the knowledge which I've gained over the past 4 or 5 years in Australia and then previously in other jurisdictions. However, I always find that when I run workshops or attend conferences, it's always a two-way learning experience. And I've already achieved a lot of learning this morning, in terms of how you've gone about setting up this new organisation and how you're planning to deliver some really significant kind of outcomes over the next few years. Now, my job is to, I suppose, provide a little bit of the theory behind outcomes measurement. But the starting point has to be why outcomes and outcomes measurement are so important. And we've touched on a lot of these issues already today. But I just want to run through some of the key issues which we've identified, not just in Australia, but in other jurisdictions. And from my understanding, some of those apply here in New Zealand. Now, where I want to start is, I don't know about you, but I've never been happy with the term not-for-profit. It just seemed completely inappropriate description of all of the organisation's efforts. It's used as a comparator to the for-profit sector. And in reality, as you all know, every organisation has to be sustainable, financially sustainable. And the only way to be financially sustainable is to generate surpluses. It is what you do with those surpluses which differentiates a for-profit organisation to a not-for-profit organisation. The reinvestment of that surplus into the organisation and into the benefit of the beneficiaries of those organisations. I've also found the word charity as being completely outdated. It really does belong to a different century, and I don't mean the 20th century, it does belong to the 19th century. It suggests that organisations are dependent on some alternative source for their funding, whether that be philanthropic or indeed government. And once again, you can't be a sustainable organisation if you are dependent on somebody else for your funding. And I think we've heard some really strong messages today, is that you've really got to control your own destiny, and I think you've now got a wonderful kind of platform to achieve that over the next few years. In addition to the kind of failure of those terminologies of not-for-profit and charity, I've noticed increasingly people talk about for-purpose organisations. Organisations which are mission-driven, are driven to be those that create social change and create social impact. And we've seen the emergence of social enterprises in many jurisdictions, and we're also increasingly now seeing alternative methods of delivering services. Increasing use of cooperatives and mutuals, much greater talk about civil society, where organisations are embedded in communities, they belong to communities, they're owned by communities. And then the latest combination of words which I'm using a lot at the moment is cooperative collective impact, where organisations like yourselves come together to deliver real change in your communities. These are the ways to deliver the long-lasting, sustainable social impact, not the old terminology of not-for-profit and charity and being dependent on government. So a key issue that you've all faced is that previously methods of funding, almost methods of assessing the performance of your organisations has been based on a very narrow understanding of value for money. You receive funding, you spend it, and you promise to deliver some outputs, and you did or you didn't. That's never been a good way of measuring organisational performance when we're talking about delivering social outcomes. What we're interested in is being able to systematically measure the changes in the lives of individuals, the economic changes, the positive experiences in terms of getting a job, a proper job, a quality job, and for that job to be sustainable. Improved quality of life, well-being of individuals, strong social relationships, and then also looking after protecting the environment. Those are the long-term outcomes which we're all interested in. And in order to achieve those outcomes, we have to use resources. And as we just heard, it's not just about financial resources, the funding that you need. your organisations cannot function without the contribution of all the people in the room and all the people you work with. The human capital of these for-purpose organisations is the most important resource that you have. You also utilise a lot of assets, the buildings that you work from, the land you use, the equipment within your organisations. That has a significant value. Without it, you can't deliver your services. And understanding that contribution is critical. And then for some organisations, they do use the land, and it's important we recognise how the land is consumed or added to by undertaking your programmes. Now, just going back to what's the problem with the old way of doing things, well, financial measurement is a very poor measurement of the value that we're interested in. Secondly, however, those methods of measurement were those that were used to allocate resources. Funding would be given to organisations which should demonstrate financial efficiency with low running costs and things, low administration costs and things like that. Completely meaningless when it comes to social outcomes. And then crucially, and what I want to spend some time talking about, and once again we've heard a lot this morning, a lot of that measurement is done without ever talking to those people who are clients, customers, beneficiaries, participants in programs. How can you allocate funding if you've not actually had a direct conversation with the people who've got problems and require support and so on? Many of the old mechanisms failed to engage the most important stakeholder, that's the people in communities. Okay, so let's just quickly do the definition thing. So outcomes are all about the positive or negative changes in stakeholders' lives over a particular kind of period of time. Now, often we think about an individual as being the person, as the main person when you undertake a program. But it's amazing how many programs are targeted on an individual. But by helping that individual, you help their families and you help the community. So when we think about the beneficiaries, those that experience positive outcomes, we have to have a much broader concept of when you deliver a program, who actually benefits from it. In addition, many programs deliver immediate benefits for individuals. Some are literally an on and off switch. And what you're able to do is to break the cycle of negative behaviour and get, especially kind of juveniles and so on, onto a correct path. And it's almost immediate. You can measure that in the short term. But the reality is most of the programs that you undertake are things where you can only measure the changes in people's lives over the medium to long term. But how many organisations have actually allocated resources to that long-term measurement? So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. There's also kind of direct and what we call kind of spillover effects from programs. You do something, but in fact, there's a significant benefit to other people, often individuals, in problems being addressed and then benefiting families and communities. And I talked about, when we talk about outcomes, it's pretty broad. It can be economic, it can be social, it can be human, and it can be environmental. And sometimes when we talk about outcomes, we also talk about impact. The difference between the two is that impact is the combination of the net benefits of all of the outcomes. So when you've done a program, you add up all the changes, positive and negative, and what you get out at the end is an impact. Now, the reality is, measuring outcomes and measuring impact, you still have to do the fundamental measurement of the inputs, the resources you need to measure the activities you undertake, the outputs you produce, the number of clients you have. You can only go on to measure outcomes if you've got those building blocks in place. Many organisations have got those foundation blocks and are well prepared then to move on to measuring outcomes. Some smaller organisations may still have not got the inputs, activities and outputs measurement kind of quite correct. They'll need a little bit of capacity building. But once those building blocks are in place, an organisation can move on to measure outcomes. Now, when we talk about why measure outcomes, one of the things which we've noticed over the last kind of 12 to 18 months is how important it is for those people who have a particular problem, with their lives. They want to have some form of choice in terms of which service to then use. We have to move away from you have a problem, this is the only solution to that problem. So increasingly, people who've got, say, people with disabilities, people who are struggling to find pathways to employment, they don't just want to have the one option. They want to be able to pursue their own aspirations and goals. And although it may mean kind of traveling a short distance, further than the nearest kind of provider, it allows them to align their interests with an organization which perhaps can say that they produce the outcomes which that person wants. So when it comes to measuring outcomes, thinking about what clients are looking for, their goals and aspirations in life, measuring outcomes allows you to communicate that effectively. Now, I'm not going to go through the detail of these slides. Some of them are notes which you can use after if you're interested in pursuing this further. But one of the big drivers of measuring outcomes is clearly the funders, the government agencies especially, who are looking to change how things progress in terms of improving the lives of individuals. Now, governments have recognised, thankfully, that funding activities and outputs isn't getting us where we want to be. There are still significant social problems out there, despite billions of dollars being spent. And alongside that, there is increasing recognition that the more you invest in prevention, the early intervention and breaking the cycle, ultimately delivers that long-term value in terms of better outcomes for individuals and communities. So we're right on the cusp of, I think, governments in many jurisdictions, including New Zealand, recognising the word investment when it comes to creating social value. This is really important. Client-directed care as well, which attached to giving people kind of choice and control on how they receive services. That's become fairly standard policy now in many jurisdictions. We're also seeing mechanisms which can be called payment by results or payment by outcomes or payment for success. So this notion that if you're not funding activities or specific outputs, what are you funding? Well, maybe you're funding results, which preferably are real changes to people's lives, real outcomes. Once again, it's a fundamental change in how organisations will operate going forward. There's always been evidence-based policy, apparently, but the reality is a lot of that has not actually then led to better policy in the future. I think the difference, what we're seeing at the moment, is building evidence which is based on focusing on what works in what circumstance. A lot more sophisticated and refined than what has gone before. So once again, politicians, senior public servants are asking for, asking the question, what works? If you tell me what works, we'll fund it. Okay, and then also what we've heard is there's increasing use of frameworks like social return on investment and results-based accountability. All those things are increasingly the norm when it comes to government funding and public services. So just summing that up, basically continuing to do the same thing just isn't really an option. The status quo is not an option. Very rarely do you get through a workshop or a presentation without Albert Einstein's quote kind of getting mentioned. But we are at a time where there are higher expectations in terms of public service delivery. People are challenging existing methods of delivering. Yet the existence of the wicked social problems, the persistence of justice issues, domestic violence, homelessness and so on, it's just unacceptable. We've also got increasing demand with aging populations, and some of the health issues which seem to be common with our times, which we've yet to kind of gain control over. So diabetes and things like that. They're real kind of wicked problems which seem to be resistant to existing approaches. And then typically, alongside all of that, there's less tax revenues to actually cover the costs of all of this. So this requires organisations like yours to be innovative, to invest in research and development, to find what works, and then to invest in those activities. If something doesn't work, you have to ditch it. You have to find a different way of doing it. So this is why when it comes to being a for-purpose organisation, you should look at your mission statement. You should make sure it does properly articulate the outcomes which you're seeking to achieve and the people that you are seeking to deliver those services to. So outcomes are actually a fundamental purpose of a for-purpose organisation. So therefore, the strategies should all be around delivering those outcomes. So when it comes to performance measurement, when you have the monthly finance management meetings, there should be an equivalent monthly outcome performance management meeting. How many organisations have got the internal systems to do that? We have to change how organisations are structured to achieve that, but that's where we need to be. Now, the good thing is, with some exceptions, there's a high level of collaboration amongst for-purpose organisations. People share how they're going about measuring outcomes, the frameworks they're using, the definitions. Often, they're published and shared, which then means organisations can become high-performing and learning organisations very rapidly if they choose to go down that pathway. So when it comes to why measure outcomes, I actually find the biggest driver of this is not actually all those external factors. It is those organisations that want to improve, want to excel. They're the ones who see outcomes measurement as being a fundamental part of achieving that goal of being an excellent organisation. So I just thought I'd throw in a few sporting kind of references here. So I'm actually English. If you hadn't noticed, I'm English. I'm not actually from Australia. So I had to be embarrassed by the England's performance against the Australian cricket team in the last Ashes series. And the transformation of that organisation from losers to winners was around by identifying a number of individuals that could actually strengthen the whole team by focusing on those individuals. The guy with the moustache on the right in particular, he went from the biggest failure to the biggest success, understanding the weaknesses, what he needed to improve in order to take that team onto a new level, focusing on individuals, to transform how a team works. Now, this is the British cycling team, 2 Tour de France winners, numerous Olympic gold medals and so on. That team is built around measuring everything and looking for a 100% improvement in everything they do. And then you add it all together and then you win. So a different approach, not focusing on an individual or a couple of individuals, but focusing on the organisation as a whole. Now, just to kind of put things in context, I know you're all rugby league fans, but I tend to think, England having lost recently to the All Blacks, that in some ways, over decades, they seem to have combined those two things, investing in individuals and investing in a system and an organisation for sustained excellence, apart from 1 or 2 World Cup hiccups. So organisational improvement, to me, is the biggest reason why you should be measuring outcomes. And I think I've already heard in the room today a commitment to do that. Now, I mentioned early on in one of the slides, one of the problems with the existing methods of measurement is they never really engage with the most important stakeholders. So this is what makes a lot of difference when you do measurement of social outcomes, is the degree to which you engage with those people who are affected by it, but also those that contribute to change. You lot, all the people who do all the work. You have amazing insights into the lives of people. Many people have got problems. There has to be an efficient method of getting that knowledge into the design and the delivery of programs. And using a systematic process of measuring social outcomes gives you that voice to actually kind of change things and identify the things which work. So, key aspects of measuring outcomes is the engagement of stakeholders. Individuals, families, organisations, collectives of organisations, they're all, should be engaged with as appropriate. So a key step in measuring outcomes is mapping who all the stakeholders are, to understand the interdependence between organisations and individuals. Very few organisations achieve what they achieve without doing some of it in partnership. Partnership collaboration is a good thing. every organisation can't do everything. So often building strategic partnerships is the best way to achieve the outcomes. And as I've mentioned several times, often you can't help an individual unless you engage a family. So understanding how important a context is, a family and a community, is a key element of understanding how outcomes are delivered. So stakeholder engagement becomes a differentiator. If you see some measurement of outcomes and there's no reference to direct engagement with stakeholders, it won't be any good. It'll just be a set of numbers. So it is through this process that you get not just the numbers, but also the stories and the insights. So this is what we tend to do when we actually talk to organisations about how they actually deliver outcomes, and I get them to start kind of saying what organisations they work with. It ends up like a dense network of interconnections. You can't do what you do without having those relationships. Another key thing which we found in doing kind of work over the last kind of 12 or 18 months is that many programs, when it comes to the funding that's provided, there is an assumption almost that all the clients are broadly the same. But you all know from the jobs that you do, you've got those people which have got really high vulnerabilities and really low capabilities. And they're fundamentally different from those people with low vulnerabilities and high capability. They all get grouped together. When you come to actually deliver services, you have to differentiate between those because you can light touch some and then you need to spend a lot of time with others. If you don't segment those clients, then there's no way you can be delivering kind of excellent services. And then the other thing is, because of your engagement with those clients, you start to understand their expectations and aspirations. And that's not saying that everybody should have every opportunity. It's just somebody who's been chronically homeless for 20 years wants stability. But a young girl out of foster care and rough sleeping wants to get back to her family and community. So the expectations and aspirations are often of individuals in programs are often very different. Measuring outcomes forces you to consider those vulnerabilities, capabilities, and aspirations. So that means that when you do this kind of measuring of social outcomes, you end up with something which is pretty complex. You end up with an outcomes measurement framework with different types of clients and different types of outcomes and how they link together. If you don't do that, then, as I say, the measurement will be pretty weak and won't actually reflect the reality of what you do. But you can't measure everything. I mean, there's just not enough funding to do the level of measurement that most organisations would like. So therefore, we have this use of the accountancy term of materiality. You try and kind of find out those things which are most material, most relevant, most significant. And usually it's an iterative process where you come to your view as to what you think is the most material outcome for a particular client group. But then you talk to the other stakeholders and they confirm or disagree with you. And at the end of it, you have a subset of the most important outcomes for your stakeholders. And then that's what you invest the measurement time in. You don't try and cover everything. You home in on the most important changes in their lives and do a really good job of that. Now, we do that process through a thing called the theory of change. And many organizations have got logic models. They've gone through that kind of process. We prefer to use the theory of change just because it's a broader concept. It's much more sophisticated. Doesn't rely so much on the cause and effect, which may work in science, but doesn't work in the lives of most individuals. So a theory of change is a depiction of how a program is meant to work, what it's supposed to achieve. If there are cause and effect relationships, we'll identify them. But it allows you to explore the how and why of your program. This is a really enriching process when you do this with your teams. It gives you an opportunity to find out those people who are directly engaged with individuals, what's really going on, or what works and what doesn't work. Now, I like to use theory of change because prior to kind of doing, say, a workshop with your team, you actually review the evidence. You look at what academics have written on a particular topic, particular kind of problem, a particular type of intervention. You utilize any evaluations which are done before. So you go into it with a body of evidence. But then what you hear is the real, rich, direct experience of those people who work on the program. So you've got both evidence and real experience in the room at the same time. That's when you get into the understanding of how a program works. Now, you can use this particular approach to evaluate all programs, but increasingly we find the best use of it is when you're designing a program or you're seeking to predict the outcomes of your programs that you're running. So you don't do the really difficult stuff of trying to measure the past. You set a way of measuring for the future. Now, often, and certainly where I've heard, many organizations run many different services for many different client groups. So before you do the in-depth work like theory of change, you really need to do a high-level version of it, which is you as an organization as a whole, to try and work out all those different main client groups and client services that you have, and what you're trying to achieve for those individuals at a really high level. So get a sense of how the organization is functioning. Once you've done that, then you can home in on a specific program and really kind of delve into the detail. Now, when it comes to measuring impact, you have to do this properly. You can't, and you can't dabble with it. You can't come up with a report which is not well-founded, because people will read it and they just say, look, I've worked in that field. It's just not right. It's just unrealistic to think that you've achieved those outcomes or that impact. Now, one way of avoiding that is to adopt a strong kind of evaluative approach or research approach. And ultimately, when you deliver a program, you really need to know what would have happened if you hadn't have done your program. What would have happened to that individual if your program didn't exist? It's like people who go to a chiropractor. I think the statistics are something like 20% of people, their backs get better within 2 or 3 days anyway. However, chiropractors can help people get back to work quicker than if they just let it kind of go on from day after day. So when you think about your programs, you should be thinking for each of your clients, what would happen if we weren't here? Is there an alternative? Or are we actually the only source of support that they have? So there's a kind of evaluation term called dead weight. What would have happened anyway? Clearly, what you want to be doing is that real kind of added value stuff. Not stuff which other organizations could do or could be done by the person on their own. You also want to make sure that you're not just displacing one problem from one area to another. Once again, in certain circumstances, that's what you're doing. You're helping in one area, but actually, there's still just displacing it from another area. And then finally, something which is talked about a lot, you really want to know how important your program was in changing somebody's life, the attribution of change to your organization or contribution. But I'm actually moving away from that terminology, because I firmly believe that most organizations cannot actually deliver those outcomes for clients without involving other organizations and being interdependent on the work of other organizations. So we should actually be celebrating those relationships, recording them, measuring them, and actually saying, we've achieved this because we're in partnership with another organization, or you're part of a collective like you are. You as an organization on your own would not be able to achieve it without those relationships. Okay, in terms of principles, there's a lot of principle stuff based around measuring outcomes, and we've already mentioned some involving stakeholders, making sure you understand that theory of change, be accurate and credible. Do that, what would have happened anyway? How much did our kind of work contribute? How much did we rely on other organizations? So that's what a theory of change kind of process looks like. You go through step by step. You think about the inputs, the activities, the outputs from your programs, and then work out what the outcomes are as a team, and really looking into how things connect together, how different activities kind of work in combination to achieve those outcomes. Now, the reason why this is really important is if you're able to measure, report, demonstrate your outcomes, there has to be a feedback loop, in terms of them being able to get more inputs, more financial resources, be able to get further kind of volunteers or other support work that you have. So once again, this is a fundamental driver for organizations to do this. It is a way of securing long-term income. So this type of process ends up, and I'm not going to go through the detail, but you can end up with a nice kind of table which says, here's the stakeholders, here are the resources we use to undertake some activities, here are the outputs, but then crucially in the right-hand column, what is it we're really talking about? Increased community inclusion, increased sense of security, improved personal health, and this is in relation to community housing for disadvantaged youth. These words came from stakeholder engagement, involving them in that theory of change discussion, asking them what changes in their lives. Often it's better to present that type of information in a bit of a diagram, so it's visually a bit more attractive and you get a sense of lines between things where lines do exist and so on. And it becomes quite powerful because you can engage your teams in this kind of process, but you've also then got a document at the end of it, a diagram. And these things never end up being static. People go back to them and say, we've missed out something here, or we should be adding something over there. So as I mentioned, the theory of change process is all about combining evidence and that direct experience. So from the preparatory work you do, you don't go into it with a blank sheet of paper. You go into it with a good understanding of what's already known about a particular problem, about a particular client group, about a particular intervention. Whether that be from academic sources or evaluations or from the organization's existing programs. But then crucially what it does is get those direct experiences of those delivering the services, those who are receiving the services, and other relevant stakeholders. And you go backwards and forwards until you feel as if you've got one of those diagrams which is robust, where you could put it in front of another team member and say, this is what we do, do you agree to it? Now this looks hellishly complex, but I wanted to include it because what it does is forces you to think about how you use things like human capital and intellectual capital. Often when we do measurement, we don't fully think about how important the knowledge and experience of the workers are to delivering a service. We just look at the dollars that we spent on salaries. But the reality is you've often got professional staff with high qualifications with 20 years worth of experience. We don't properly record it. So if for some reason an organization loses staff and replaces it with young graduates out of school or out of the local college and so on, you're losing significant human capital, loss of knowledge, loss of expertise and so on. Using a particular framework which is on the previous diagram forces you to think about each of those very, very important contributors to the creation of value. Now, one of the types of value which we also forget, and I've repeated it several times, and once again this complex diagram forces you to think about, and that is the value of relationships, of doing things collaboratively, and how things connect together through that network analysis. So there are tools which are available to help you do all of this, and they're increasingly proven tools, and so it is possible. Now when it comes to measuring change, basically that's the framework. You've defined the outcomes. These are the things which your organization seeks to change. But ultimately you need to know how many people have experienced the change, the degree to which the change has actually occurred, and crucially kind of over a kind of specific kind of time period. Now, it's very, very expensive to reconstruct what's happened in the past, but you can do it if needs be. You can ask people, how well are they today? And they say, are you feel better or worse than you did 3 months ago? You can kind of get that kind of time kind of measurement through one kind of iteration of a survey, actually asking people how their lives have changed. But for you and your organizations and services you deliver, it's much more about creating baselines and then to be measuring the improvement against those baselines for all of your clients. Once again, there are systems to do this to make it relatively easy, but you have to embed it within organizations. And once again, you have to make sure you cover all of the bases in terms of doing the job properly. Now, many organizations have got access to support which would allow them to undertake survey work in a robust way. And as I say, you can kind of use existing evidence and use it locally to great effect. So there's lots of lessons on how to do it well. And I'll just go through a couple more slides because it's important to get one or two of the basics which are pretty crucial to you as people who get directly involved in things. Ideally, what you want are these kind of objective indicators that something can be measured in a really kind of sound way. So for people, it's the number of times they go to a health clinic or see a GP. But sometimes that information is not available. So therefore, you have to ask the person about their physical health. Ask them to self-report, which is more of a subjective method. So even when sometimes you can't get the best indicator possible, there's often a pragmatic replacement for it, whilst potentially you can be developing that longer-term kind of better measure of change in an individual's life. So there's a set of guidance, as it were, how to actually do the measurement process effectively. Now, the good thing is, once you do measurement, there's some great tools as well to then display how those changes in people's lives have happened. And here's one example using an outcome star, which has got a scale of 1 to 10 for a range of different attributes of an individual. And you can plot how many clients have achieved 3 or 4 kind of places on the scale improvement in their activities. Once again, visually, it's a good way of articulating what's often a dense set of numbers. Now, once again, there's a set of tools out there which people have already developed for many problem areas. You don't have to build these things yourself from scratch. Almost every area of intervention, all types of programs, somebody's already thought about what's a good scale for measuring change. And they've tested it. And as I say, and many people, many organizations are very willing to share. So the first thing to do is always look to see if somebody else has done the hard yards first in terms of measurement. And if they have, once again, you can have simple presentations which you can share with your colleagues around change. How people have gone from very, very low status, as it were, at the beginning, and this is to do with improved money management, and then how they've actually progressed over the period of time of a particular program. And you're looking for those that have gone from very low to moderate to high and very high, where your program then has obviously had a significant impact. Once again, these tools already exist. Okay, and then just last couple of slides. There's not one best approach to doing all this stuff. You really have to determine what's your goal in terms of measuring outcomes. Is it for those internal reasons or external reasons? They will actually shape what particular approach you adopt. You also have to think about whether you're going to do this for the whole organization or whether to home in initially on one program or perhaps even one client group within the program. All these things will help you start the process of measuring outcomes. And there's lots of tools, as I say, which are available to help you do it. The one that we use a lot is social return on investment. We just found that this has been particularly useful in certain circumstances, especially when you're looking to a program in terms of potentially investing in it further or expanding it. You really want to know what the level of return is by investing in a particular program. This methodology, which is an enhancement of cost-benefit analysis, something which Treasury people within government feel comfortable with, it's got some sound foundations to it, and then it's got some additional components around how you measure social change when there isn't kind of an easy dollar figure to identify. So things like an improvement in somebody's mental health, reduced anxiety, reduced depression. One way of measuring that and giving it a financial value is to ask them how many times they visited their GP, and how many, and whether they're using lower levels of prescription drugs and so on. All of those are a way of actually measuring improvements in mental health by using a cost for a GP visit, a cost of prescription drugs and so on. So these things are possible. Sometimes they're challenging, but if you use experts, then it's relatively easy to do and to learn from the work that they've done previously. So it ticks all the boxes in terms of the important things when you do measure outcomes, in terms of involving stakeholders. You're doing things robustly in terms of measuring things like dead weight and so on. But as I mentioned on several occasions, the real attraction of using social return on investment is the way it allows organizational learning. It forces you to go through a process which engages your staff, engaging your clients, and takes them through that learning journey. We found by doing financial valuations for the whole service, it means that you are able to present that dreaded value for money figure in a much better, more sophisticated way. You can still say for this amount of dollar, you get that amount of dollar of value. So it has that advantage. It opens up social finance, social impact bonds. It's increasingly a requirement of funders to have access to this information. So it has the potential to address a lot of issues, but it has some weaknesses as well, in terms of, it is still a relatively new technique, and there's still elements of it which require further and further investment, but as I say, using kind of experts is one way of avoiding some of the risks associating with it. Okay, so just the final slide in terms of a process which we found has worked with many organizations, and that's to start off by doing an outcomes hierarchy for the organization as a whole, especially where you're running multiple programs. From that, you pick a program which you feel is the most appropriate, where you really need some answers around whether to invest in it or to scale it up. Use an SROI, theory of change process for that program. And then crucially, because you've learned so much about a program, then find a method of capturing that learning on an ongoing basis. Because you've engaged your teams and they understand how their programs work, how they create those changes in lives. When they come across something which doesn't fit in or there's a problem, they've now got a mechanism to feed that back and to improve the quality of that program. So having what's called a formative process evaluation alongside a social return on investment or measuring outcomes program is really, really important. Now, I've emphasized numbers a lot, but actually you still need all the stories. Stories on their own are no good, numbers on their own are no good. This type of mechanism allows you to capture the stories from the clients and also the workers, and also capture the numbers. And if you have some compelling dashboards, infographics and things like that, which visually represent how the organization delivers change, once again, it engages people. It allows them to show how they've actually helped create change for an individual, and similarly, how an individual has experienced change and how the organization has helped them on that journey. Now, in terms of the importance of this, I'll just reiterate a few things. This is going to become the norm. Measuring outcomes will become the norm. The sooner you get on board, the better. It is going to be ultimately the way that resources get allocated. You can provide evidence of real outcomes and impact using this approach. And if social finance takes off, as many predict it will, you can't participate in social finance unless you've got outcomes systematically measured and preferably using a financial proxy approach to the overall value of it. But it's difficult. You're all dealing with really complex problems. The funding systems are changing, but need to change quicker, and I sense you're on a journey which is very, very positive. There are no standards on how to do this, but there are emerging standards on how to do outcomes. So it may look challenging, but I think this is the right time to be investing in this particular approach, because I think over the next 3 or 4 years it will become the norm. Okay, nearly finished. And then finally, human capital. I keep on going on about it. It's important that you measure the component parts. You've got to know how much value your staff create in your programs. It's crucial how you do it. This is the final slide. So you need a new mental model. You're already thinking differently to the way you were thinking before, so which is fantastic. There's also strong evidence in this room that you've got strong leadership and culture within your organizations. You're looking to engage through your work with clients and so on in terms of understanding their lives and so on. You're looking to integrate and execute how you do things collaboratively. You're working in partnerships and collaboration. And then all you need to do is measure, then I think you'll have achieved your goal of being sustainable organizations financially and delivering real social impact and social change.